The night my son told me to leave, he didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't even look angry. He just stood in the doorway of his Chicago apartment, holding the car keys while his wife watched from the kitchen, and said quietly, "Mom, maybe it's better if you go back home for a while." I nodded because mothers don't fight their children, even when their hands start shaking. He insisted on driving me to the bus station, but halfway there, my phone slipped from my lap, and when he reached to pick it up, he saw the notification still glowing on the screen. A message from my doctor sent 20 minutes earlier. "Your test results came back. We need to discuss immediately. Your condition is worsening faster than expected." And that was the moment my son realized he hadn't just asked me to leave, he may have just sent me away at the worst possible time without knowing how little time I might actually have left. My name is Margaret Collins, and before the night my son asked me to leave his apartment, there was a time when Daniel Collins would not fall asleep unless I sat beside him, his small fingers wrapped around my wrist like he believed I might disappear if he let go. And I still remember those nights because the boy I raised was gentle in a way that made hard days easier. The kind of child who noticed when I limped after long shifts at the grocery store, the kind who quietly pushed half his dinner toward me when he thought I hadn't eaten enough. And we lived in a narrow duplex on the south side of Dayton, Ohio, where the floors creaked in winter and the heater worked only when it felt like it. And when rain leaked through the window frame near Daniel's bed, I used old towels and tape to keep the water from dripping onto his pillow. And he would sit there watching me with worried eyes, asking if I was okay, even though he was the one whose bed was getting wet. And I told him everything was fine, because mothers often hide their struggles so their children don't carry them too. And when his father died when Daniel was 4, I learned quickly how quiet a house can become, how heavy the evenings feel when there is no one else to share them with. And I chose not to remarry, not because I didn't feel lonely sometimes, but because Daniel needed consistency more than I needed comfort. And I worked 6 days a week, stocking shelves, cleaning offices at night, and sometimes helping neighbors with laundry just to cover school fees. And Daniel saw more than I realized because when he was 16, he noticed I had been wearing the same shoes for 2 winters. And he pretended he didn't care at first, but later that night, I heard him crying softly in his room. And the next morning, he hugged me tighter than usual before school. And when he received his acceptance letter to the University of Illinois, he held the envelope with shaking hands. And I remember reading it slowly, wanting that moment to stretch just a little longer. And he kept saying, "We did it," not "I did it." We did it. And for years after he moved to Chicago, he called every Sunday, sometimes twice, asking if I was eating properly, if my knees were hurting, if I needed help with anything around the house. And I told him I was fine, because mothers often hide their struggles so their children don't carry them too. And when he met Rebecca Lawson at a company event, I heard a new excitement in his voice, something brighter than I had heard in years. And I wanted that happiness for him, truly, even when the calls slowly became shorter after they married, even when he sounded distracted sometimes, like his attention was divided between two lives. And I told myself that was normal, that sons grow, that marriages change priorities. And when I fainted in my kitchen one afternoon and my neighbor found me on the floor, Daniel flew to Dayton the next morning, his face pale with worry, and he insisted I move in with him for a while, saying he'd feel better knowing I wasn't alone. And I agreed quietly, believing I was stepping back into my son's life again, not realizing I was stepping into a space where love still existed, but comfort had already begun to shift. And when I arrived at their high-rise apartment overlooking the river, Rebecca greeted me politely, her smile warm but careful, and Daniel hugged me longer than usual, and I told myself everything would be fine because I trusted the boy I raised, not yet understanding how easily distance can grow, even between people who could not sleep unless they were holding each other close. And sometimes, distance doesn't begin with arguments. It begins with silence. With small changes you almost convince yourself don't matter, until one day you realize everything feels different. If you've ever felt someone you love slowly drifting away, stay with me, because what happened next was the moment I realized I might already be losing my son, even before he asked me to leave. At first, I tried to make myself as small as possible inside Daniel and Rebecca's apartment, waking before sunrise so I wouldn't interrupt their mornings, moving quietly through the kitchen while the city lights still reflected against the river below. And I made coffee the way Daniel used to like it, though he now preferred something stronger from a machine that hummed softly against the counter. And Rebecca thanked me politely, always politely, but her politeness felt careful, like she was measuring each interaction. And I told myself that sharing space takes adjustment, that I was the one stepping into their routine, not the other way around. And I folded blankets, wiped counters, and cooked simple meals that filled the apartment with familiar smells. Though one evening Rebecca mentioned gently that the spices lingered longer than she expected, and I apologized immediately, opening windows even though the air outside was cold. And Daniel stood nearby, shifting his weight slightly, not disagreeing but not defending either. And I noticed that small moment, because mothers notice the quiet changes first, the subtle pauses, the way conversations become shorter. And over the next few weeks, I stayed mostly in my room near the hallway, reading or watching the river traffic below. And when guests came over, I excused myself early, not wanting to intrude. And Daniel knocked at first, asking if I wanted to join them, but gradually the knocks stopped, replaced by muffled laughter from the living room that felt distant even though I was only a few steps away. And I told myself it was natural, that young couples need privacy, and I tried to help in quieter ways, leaving groceries stocked, laundry folded, and notes reminding Daniel to take his vitamins the way I used to when he lived at home. But Rebecca gently moved the notes aside one morning, smiling as she told me she preferred keeping things uncluttered. And I nodded, embarrassed, realizing I had brought habits from a different life into theirs. And Daniel began working later hours, sometimes returning after I had already gone to bed. And when we did sit together, the conversations felt careful, like we were both trying not to step into something uncomfortable. And one evening, I overheard Rebecca telling him she felt like they were adjusting their entire routine, that she worried about long-term arrangements. And Daniel responded quietly, saying it was temporary, that my health had worried him. And I stepped back into my room before they noticed I had passed by, my chest tightening slightly, because I understood what temporary sometimes becomes. And the next week, Rebecca's sister visited for dinner, and while we sat at the table, she asked casually how long I planned to stay, and Rebecca answered before I could, saying they were still figuring things out, and Daniel looked down at his plate. And that silence felt heavier than any argument. And later that night, I heard them talking behind their closed bedroom door, voices low and steady, not angry, just serious. And the following morning, Daniel avoided my eyes at breakfast, stirring his coffee longer than necessary. And I felt something shift inside me, the quiet awareness that decisions were being formed without words. And I began packing small things slowly, not because anyone had asked yet, but because mothers sometimes prepare for departures before they're spoken aloud. And on Friday evening, the air inside the apartment felt unusually still, like the calm before a storm. And when Daniel asked if we could talk, I already understood that the distance between us had quietly grown wider than either of us had realized. And sometimes the hardest part isn't the moment someone asks you to leave. It's recognizing that the decision had been building silently long before the words were finally spoken. And that's the hardest part, when no one raises their voice, when no one says anything cruel, but you can still feel the space growing wider every day until the room you're standing in no longer feels like home. Stay with me, because the night everything finally broke, the rain had already started, and I didn't know that leaving quietly would almost cost us all. The rain started just after sunset, tapping softly against the tall windows before turning heavier, the kind of steady rain that makes the city lights blur and the streets below shine like dark glass. And I was sitting quietly in the living room, folding a small blanket when Daniel stepped out of the hallway and asked if we could talk. And I knew immediately from the way he stood, shoulders slightly tense, eyes careful, that something had already been decided. And Rebecca stayed in the kitchen, pretending to rinse a glass that didn't need washing, her back turned, but her attention clearly fixed on us. And Daniel sat across from me, leaning forward with his hands clasped together, and he spoke gently, almost too gently, saying he thought it might be better if I returned to Dayton for a while, that he would help arrange everything, that it didn't mean anything permanent, just some space so they could settle back into their routine. And I nodded before he finished, because mothers learn to recognize unfinished sentences, and I told him I understood that young couples need their privacy, and I kept my voice steady even though my chest felt tight. And Daniel offered to drive me to the bus station, insisting it was the least he could do, and I agreed because refusing would only make the moment harder. And I packed quietly, the same 2 bags I had brought with me, moving slowly through the small room, folding my clothes carefully as if the order might somehow keep my emotions from slipping. And when I stepped into the hallway, Daniel took one of the bags from my hand, and we rolled the elevator down in silence, the rain now louder against the building's glass entrance. And once inside the car, he turned on the windshield wipers, and the rhythmic motion filled the silence between us. And we drove through wet streets where reflections stretched across the pavement, and neither of us spoke much, just small comments about traffic and weather, the kind people make when they're avoiding something deeper. And halfway to the station, my phone slipped from my lap and fell near Daniel's foot. And when he leaned down at a red light to pick it up, the screen lit briefly, showing the message that had arrived minutes earlier from my doctor. And I saw his expression change, the quiet concern replacing his careful calm. And he handed me the phone slowly, asking if everything was okay. And I told him it was probably nothing, just a routine follow-up, because I didn't want to add weight to a moment already heavy enough. And he nodded, though I could tell the message lingered in his mind. And when we reached the station, he walked me inside, insisting on waiting until I was seated, and the fluorescent lights made everything feel colder. And he set my bag beside me, hesitating as if unsure whether to hug me, and finally he did, briefly but tightly. And I told him to drive safely, and he nodded, turning away after one last glance. And I watched him disappear through the glass doors into the rain. And as I sat there, the station quiet around me, I felt a sudden dizziness, the kind that comes quietly at first, and I tried to steady myself, gripping the edge of the seat, but the lights seemed to blur slightly, and the last thing I remember was a stranger asking if I was all right. And the next morning, Daniel's phone rang while he was getting ready for work, and when he heard the hospital nurse explain that I had been found unconscious at the station, that my blood pressure had spiked dangerously, he stood frozen, remembering the message on my phone, remembering the quiet ride. And as he rushed to the hospital through streets still damp from the night before, he realized that sometimes the moment you let someone walk away, believing there will always be more time, becomes the moment you nearly lose them. And by the time he reached my bedside, the silence between us felt heavier than anything we had left unsaid.